We were assigned the concrete canoe, the main goal being that we had to build a canoe using only water, cement, and an aggregate to somehow make it float. Prior to this project, we knew essentially nothing about concrete nor cement. Through research, we learned concrete is a composite material made up of cement, water, and aggregate. The performance of the concrete depends on the ratio of the liquid in cement as well as the different type of aggregate used. Using less water reduces the amount of shrinking due to the drying process. On the other hand, excess water will lead to a higher slump, which is a measure of consistency and fluidity of concrete. The higher the slump, the less the strength, durability, and permeability of the concrete. If the slump is too low, it won't shape easily. The slump test is used to check the workability of freshly made concrete. It can also be used as an indicator of an improperly mixed batch for larger structures such as bridges and sidewalks. We also had to consider concrete expansion. When concrete first dries, it shrinks as the moisture is lost. However, once dry, it has the ability to expand when it gets hot or when the moisture content changes. Likewise, colder temperatures cause the concrete to contract. The biggest influencer for the amount by which it expands or contracts is the type of aggregate used. To think of how the canoe would actually float, we had to be aware of the Archimedes principle. This is the idea that if weight of the water displaced is less than the weight of the object will sink. Also, whether the object is fully or partially submerged, the upward buoyant force exerted on a body is equal to the weight of the fluid that the body displaces and acts in the upward direction.
When you imagine concrete, you imagine sidewalks or maybe buildings. You never really think of anything that floats because of how heavy concrete is. So when we were first given the assignment, we started brainstorming ideas on what sorts of aggregate we could potentially use in our concrete mix to make the canoe float. We came together and collaboratively formed a list of questions that we would need to address to be able to make a concrete canoe, representing the ask stage of the engineering design process. We imagined using sand and glass beads, but ultimately decided to use styrofoam as our acting aggregate because of its light weight and ability to be shaved into small pieces, making our mixture more consistent. We watched FEDD videos from previous years as inspiration for good ideas and likewise things we should avoid or not do. In the imagined step of the design process, all members were collaborating and building off of each other for ideas as to how to form a general solution for the task at hand. With our $40 budget, we had to find cheap yet effective materials in order to create our mold. We decided to use pieces of bendable plywood as the sides of the canoe and more styrofoam to mold the bow and stern of the canoe. We made drawings as to how the mold could be constructed and how the concrete could be formed around it, ensuring we stayed within the dimensions and proper shape. Next came the create step for our first attempt. Our first attempt at mixing the concrete was not a success as we had too much water and styrofoam in the mixture, which made it close to impossible for the concrete to stick to the mold. Our mixture at this time was an approximate ratio of 1 to 1 to 1, or 1 cup of water per 1 cup of cement and 1 cup of styrofoam on top of that.
Another challenge that presented itself during this first trial was that we bought concrete mix rather than cement mix, which proved to be two very different things as concrete mix contains large rocks and sediment. We had to sift through the mix every time we went to use more cement. We ended up using a metal folder holder with 3 levels to sift the concrete mix, which made the process a lot easier and more efficient. After the failure of our first attempt, we had to go back and rethink the ratio of our mixture. So the second time around, we decided to try 1 cup of cement to 1/4 cup of water to 1/2 cup of styrofoam. This time around, the mixture looked more consistent and stuck to the mold. We initially made our canoe quite large, which increased the amount of time it took to dry, on top of the fact that we had the canoe drying under a bag so the moisture didn't evaporate too quickly and cause any cracking. When the canoe was finally dry, we still needed to sand down the sides to make it appear to be more smooth, as well as try to cut down on the height of the canoe, since it was about 7 inches tall and the maximum height allowed was 6 inches. However, even with an actual sander and heavy grit sandpaper, we just couldn't get the height or weight of the canoe down to our desired measurements. At this point, we didn't have enough time to completely reconstruct a new canoe, so we decided to try and chisel the canoe down as an attempt to make it lose weight and hopefully make it float. But as it turns out, chiseling a concrete canoe is more difficult than we expected and ultimately ended with us breaking our canoe into a bunch of pieces the night before FEDD.
With the canoe being in pieces less than 24 hours before FEDD, we had to think quickly and come up with an idea as to how to salvage what we had and at least bring something that resembled a canoe. whether it floated or not. Luckily, the bottom joint of the canoe stayed intact, so in an attempt to save time, we mixed new concrete using the same mixture formula and recreated the bow and stern of the canoe, sat down and blow-dried it until a change in color was evident, and then let the canoe sit and dry overnight, until the next day when we had to present. At the FEDD presentation day, our canoe did not float, but we were at least able to bring a concrete structure that resembled a canoe and hit on all of the requirements, except the floating aspect. If we were able to recreate this project, we definitely would have started earlier and may have tested other aggregates other than styrofoam to see if the outcomes would have been any different. I would for sure say that in order to stay within the required dimensions, make sure you leave your concrete enough room to dry and expand, because that's a big part of concrete settling and it's something we didn't really account for when we made our first mold. Our advice to the freshmen next year assigned the concrete canoe would be, don't procrastinate and don't assume it will be an easy project just because past groups have had success with their methods and techniques. There will be a lot of trial and error alongside this project, and you just have to be able to take the losses and find ways to grow and continue, which really is the epitome of engineering.